Explaining the Six-Day War. In 1948, Israel was created, and not long after, the Arab-Israeli Wars broke out, resulting in Egypt occupying Gaza and the Jordanians occupying the West Bank. Eventually, Egypt would start buying weapons from communist Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union would start supporting Arab nations. Because of this, nations like the USA would start supporting and supplying Israel. Tensions began to rise between Egypt and Israel after Egyptian President Nasser blocked off Israeli ships from the Straits of Tiran. This would then begin the Suez Crisis. Israel would join Britain and France in attacking Egypt, and Israel would occupy the Sinai Peninsula. After the Suez Crisis ended, however, this occupation was handed over to the UN. This gave the Israelis confidence in the fact that they now knew that they could hold a full-scale war against another nation. This crisis would also establish Nasser of Egypt as the figurehead of Arab nationalism. Tensions would rise again when Egypt and Syria formed the short-lived United Arab Republic. Israel would launch a reprisal mission on Syria, forcing the Egyptians to mobilize their army. Even though the crisis ended quickly, the Israelis' unpreparedness would force them to increase their military intelligence, along with policies. The PLO would form in the 1960s, and in 1963, coups in Syria would put the Ba'athist Party in power, and they were anti-Israeli. With the new Ba'athist Party in power, small clashes would occur along the Jordan River between Ba'athist forces and Israeli forces. After this, they would sign a defensive pact with Egypt. In 1966, the Israelis would launch a reprisal mission in Jordan. The Samu incident in Jordan would cause large-scale protests and would put pressure on King Hussein of Jordan. King Hussein would blame Nasser for being unable to come to his aid. Because of this, Nasser would also be put under pressure to respond. In 1967, Nasser would gain a report from the Soviets saying that Israeli troops were on the Syrian border. This was false. Nasser would respond by kicking UN peacekeepers out of the Sinai Peninsula and placing his own army in there. On May 22nd, Nasser would block the Straits of Tiran from Israeli ships once again, even though this could cause the Americans to go to war. However, U.S. President Johnson would not want to get involved in the conflict and would instruct the Israelis to do the same. Nasser around this time would sign a defensive pact with the Jordanians, and other Arab nations would move their troops to the Israeli border. I would rather stay neutral in the controversy of this entire war, so here's two scenarios. Israel needed to launch a preemptive strike on the Egyptians to gain an advantage on the larger forces on their border, or Israel knew that the Egyptians were not ready for war, but used this opportunity to launch an aggressive attack with their superior army. You may choose which one you believe. On June 5, 1967, the Israelis launched an air bombing on the Egyptian Air Force, while also moving into the Sinai Peninsula. Due to this, Jordan and Syria would respond to the call to arms and join the war, while other Arab nations would send weapons. However, Israeli air bombings would render their air forces useless as well, so the Syrians and Jordanians would resort to shelling Israel directly. The Israelis would follow the retreating Egyptian army and capture the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza in just a few days. They would also push the Jordanians outside of the West Bank in just a few days. The last 2 days were spent pushing the Syrians out of the Golan Heights. The United States, fearing that the Soviet Union would join the war on the side of the Arabs, would push Israel to sign an armistice. While the peace process was still going on, the Israelis would continue to occupy their captured lands. The Arab states met in Khartoum and would declare that they would never recognize the state of Israel. In the UN Security Council Resolution 242, the Arab states would agree to make concessions, in turn, for the Israelis to give back the land that they took. This, however, would take another war and peace resolution for the Sinai Peninsula to be given back to Egypt, and the Israelis kept the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. In conclusion, the Six-Day War was a 6-day war, and is also a very controversial topic. Thank you for watching this video on the Six-Day War.